Mr. Ring going over the quiz corrections for Precalculus Quiz number 12.
What's wrong with you?
4.4, March 18, 2009.
I love math.
Question 1, I asked you guys to skip because the typo was that 8/3 was supposed to be in front of the x, but we didn't do that. Number 2, what is the amplitude of y equals 4 sine x? Well, it'd be helpful to write your letters right above it. So essentially you have a sine x. Your b value would just be a 1, so it doesn't change anything, but you want the amplitude. Amplitude is the letter a, so a is equal to 4, which is letter choice C. Question number 5, find the vertical translation. Vertical translation is letter D. So this is D plus a sine. In this problem, they should factor out if we needed it. But we're just looking for the D value, and the D value is the constant. How do you know it's the D value? It says plus or minus. Now, sometimes they put it over here as well, so pay attention to that. And it's positive, so you're going up. Question number 4. Find the period of y equals negative 2 pi x. So again, write the letters. I know it's the b value because it's right in front of the x, the coefficient of x. So that would be b equals pi. Well, I have sine. The period for sine is period equals 2 pi over b. Well, if I put in pi there, these will cancel, and then my period is going to be equal to 2. And 2 is letter choice D. Question number 5. Find the phase shift of the graph of the function. Y equals negative 2 sine 4x minus pi over 2. Notice the first thing you're going to have to do in this problem is you're going to have to factor out a GCF, the greatest common factor. How do you know to factor out a GCF? If there's a number in front of x like there is inside the parentheses, that's the number you're going to pull out. How do you figure out what goes there? Well, factoring, its opposite is distributing. So 4 times x gives me 4x. 4 times a box equals pi over 2. So I did a little side problem over here. 4 times the box equals pi over 2. To solve for the box, I divide by 4 on both sides. Dividing by 4, the 4 is in the denominator. So the 4's here will cancel. Then you just multiply across. Pi times 1 is pi. 2 times 4 is 8. So the box is pi over 8. Remember, if you distributed here, you would get 4 pi over 8, which reduces to pi over 2. The phase shift is the letter C. So notice, in that kind of like formula, with the A, B, C's, and D's, the transformations of trig functions, you're looking for what's to the right of the minus sign. So x minus, and then your C value is just this right here. C is equal to pi over 8. Now, a couple of ways you can think about this. When you find your C value, if it's positive, it's going to go towards the right. So D is your correct answer. Remember, I also had a silly phrase. What is it? No, all students don't take calculus. That tells us positive or negatives. Add to x, go west. West is which direction? Left. So if you see an x adding here, a plus sign, then you're eventually going to phase shift, or the graph's going to move towards the left. Okay? If it's not adding, it's subtracting, then you're actually going the other direction, which is right. Question number 6. Which of the 2 equations below matches the graph? If you notice, I recognize that the graph has 2 of them. So this graph has, it's repeated twice. So we can say that the period, 2 periods equals, well, it finishes by 4 pi over 3. If I divide both sides by 2 here, and the reason why I do that is I get 1 period is 4 pi over 6. Well, remember, this equation looks like the sine, the inverse of sine. So if I put this equal to 2 pi, and then I cross multiply, 2 pi times 6 is 12 pi. B times 4 pi is 4 pi b. If I divide both sides by 4 pi, I get b equals 3. Now I have a b equals 3 here. I have a b equals 3 here. But in these cases, my b's are 1/3, so I would eliminate those. The next thing is to figure out, well, it doesn't even ask me to figure it out, but our a value, of course, we already know the answer is -2, because remember, sine usually starts at 0, goes up to 1, goes through 0, -1, and then 0, right? So if it starts and ends at 0, that has to be sine. That's why C is the correct answer. Remember, cosine is like a bucket, and this is kind of like a sideways S. So sine for the sideways S. Because I didn't count question number 12, then front side was out of 12 points. Back side. Each of these were worth 2 points. If I look at this equation here, all I want to do here is just figure out the period. This whole graph goes from -2 to 4 or to 2 pi, which means it completes a whole cycle, or completes one period in 4 pi. So if the period is equal to 4 pi, and my equation is 2 pi over b, then I can figure out the b value. If I just cross multiply here, 4 pi b, 2 pi times 1 gives me 2 pi. If I divide both sides by 4 pi, my pi's cancel, and then 2/4 reduces to 1/2. So if this graph has a b of 1/2, and this looks like an inverted cosine, I know that it's cosine because cosine has a bucket, right? So in this case, that would be equation 1, because my b value there is the 1/2, and we know it's a cosine. It should have a negative sign in front, but we have enough information for the answer is 1. If I look at another equation that another thing I should recognize is that its amplitude is going from the middle here to its maximum of 1. So you have an amplitude of 1, which is your a value. If I look at my other graphs, like graph number 4, this also has an amplitude of 1. Do you see that? And it does the same thing. This looks like sine, and it goes from -2 pi to 2 pi, which means it has a period of 4 pi, and you basically do the same thing here. And then my b value is 1/2. So for this one, that'll be choice 4, equation 4. The b value is 1/2. The other ones with the 1/2 here, that's my amplitude. And if you recognize that if this is 1, it's going about half. If you just focus there, starts at 0, ends at 0, that's going to be sine. And that's why it's 2. Again, this one has an amplitude of 1/2. Starts at 1/2 and ends at 1/2, so there's kind of like my cup for C, cosine. Equation number 3, those are 2 points apiece. Question number 8. This told me if you understood how to graph trig functions or not. For number 8, it says graph the following trig function over one period. Be sure to include a table of values and label your axes clearly. Y equals 4 sine 2/3 x. I randomly just picked this equation from your packet. Recognize I have no parentheses, so there's no c value. There's no plus or minus, so there is no d value. Write your letters above it, so you have an amplitude of 4 and a b value of 2/3. If my b value is 2/3, I have 2 pi divided by b, my division sign, divided by my b value, which is 2/3. I just need to change division to multiplication, and I flip these. I get 2 pi over 1 times 3 halves. You multiply across. You will get 6 pi over 2, and 6 pi over 2 means that reduces to 3 pi. Your graph will finish by 3 pi. What does that mean? That means it'll start at 0, and it'll end here at 3 pi. How do I know that each of these increments are pi? Well, this is 4 pi. This is 2 pi, and half of 2 pi is 1 pi, so each box is worth pi. Now, if I circled your x-axis around that, that basically means that a lot of you guys try to put your graph to finish at 4 pi. That's incorrect because of this information. The next thing you're going to know is that eventually your graph will end up at 4, amplitude of 4. Well, there is no phase shift, which means that I'm going to start at 0 and end at 3 pi. Well, what's half of that? 0 plus 3 is 3, and 3 divided by 2 is 3 halves. The midpoint between 0 and 3 pi is 3 over 2 pi, or 1.5 pi. If you recognize that I put these all over 1, so here's another way of thinking about it, is I just double them. So I have 0 pi over 2 and 6 pi over 2. The midpoint between 0 and 6, 0 plus 6 divided by 2 is 3. So 0, 1.5, and that's like 3, right? Now, this is an odd difference. What do I mean by that? 6 minus 3 is 3. And we do 3 divided by 2. I don't really want to do, it's just not a proper fraction. So what I did is I doubled them again. So I get 12 pi over 4, 6 pi over 4, and 0 pi over 4. Then you can kind of see that it's 0 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4. Then I'm counting by 3s. You see that? 0, 3, 6, 9, 12. Now, mine was kind of messy, so what I like to do is you can just take your x values like I did, and I like to circle them. Then I know those are actually my values on my graph. Now, what made this problem difficult was that you couldn't really see the 5 points very, very clearly. So the first thing I'm going to do with my x values, 0, pi, I circled the wrong ones. Let's use a different color. 0, 3 pi over 4, 3 halves. This one should be 9 pi over 4 and 3 pi. If I just multiply now the value by 2/3, 2/3 times 0 is 0. 2/3 times 3 pi over 4 will give me a pi over 2. That's wrong. Two-thirds times 3 halves will give me pi. 2/3 times 9/4 will give me 3 halves pi. So this is wrong. 3 halves pi. And 2/3 times 3 pi will give me 6 pi over 3, which is just 2 pi. Now, this is how you will always know you're doing these correctly. You will always get this, what I call a golden row. For sine and cosine, you will always get 0 pi over 2 pi, 3 halves pi, and 2 pi. Well, these are my x values. We multiplied our x value times 2/3, and now what we're going to do is we're just going to find sine there. Remember, if you just have your unit circle, you don't have to have one, you can just draw a quick one. Sine at 0 is 1, 0, and sine is the second part of the order pair, so that is 0. And at pi over 2, that's 0, 1. Cosine sine, so sine is 1. And you can just do over here, -1, 0. -1, 0. So then you just recognize that at 3/2 pi, my answer is, what happened here? Sine at pi, what happened? There it is. Sine at pi over 2 is 1. Sine at pi is 0. Sine at 3 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, this should be 0, -1. And then sine at 2 pi should be 0. The last step is you're multiplying by 4. Do you see that? It's multiplication. So basically you just take this previous row and then multiply by 4. 4 times 0 is 0, 4 times 1 is 4, 4 times 0 is 0, 4 times -1 is -4, and 4 times 0 is 0. And then I can just graph these points here. 0, 4, which is at 3 pi over 4. And if you'll notice that it's not actually at this line. This line is actually pi. So 3/4 of pi is like a little bit before that. 3/2 pi is between 1 pi and 2 pi. So in between, I should have 0. 9 pi over 4 is a little bit past 2. So it should be like right there, -4. And then at 3 pi, I'm at 0. Okay, how did you get 4 points for this problem? You have a table of values. Now your table of values might not look like mine. I'll show you what you could do in another way of doing these problems. You have the period. You should see the amplitude. And you have a correct graph of sine and cosine. If you had all of that, I gave you 4 points. 3 points if you made one mistake, and then kind of a really big range if you just got something correct. Graph of sine, you got the period or the amplitude, and I gave you 2 points. Now another way of doing this problem, let's say you're stuck, you're not sure how to find these values, you still need to find your 5 points, these pink ones. And another way of doing the table is just the order of operations, which is PEMDAS. Let me give you an example of that. In this equation over here, there is no parentheses. There are no exponents. You're going to do multiplication where you're starting at. My starting point, let's just say I pick this one as 3 pi. So essentially 3 pi times 2/3 will give me 2 pi. And then you're still doing multiplication. So sine times sine, the exact value of sine at 2 pi is 0. And then 0 times 4 is 0. So it's possible that your table of values just has these 5 points, and then your answer is just 0. The chart is just kind of I've found it easier just kind of like work my way down. Question number 9. Same thing, but you have y equals 1 plus 2 cosine x plus pi over 2. Some main differences between the two problems is that this problem has a parentheses, which means it has a PS, a phase shift. It's moving left or right. What's the difference between these two problems? This one, you don't have to use 0 to 2 pi, the inequality. This problem, you have to use the inequality. Notice how everything to the right of the trig function, I'm putting between 0 and 2 pi. I subtract pi over 2 from both sides. These will cancel. This becomes negative pi over 2. This one is 4 pi over 2 are equivalent. So 4 minus 1 gives me 3 pi over 2. My graph's going to start at negative pi over 2 and finish at 3 pi over 2. And you should be able to see that. Cosine starts on the y-axis itself, and we're being shifted over to the left. So a lot of students, interesting enough, who got a 3 out of 4, they have this on their paper, and I might have circled it, but their graph starts on the y-axis itself, which means they knew algebraically there was a phase shift, but they didn't show it graphically or visually. Here, their b value is 1, so it's just 2 pi over b, so my period is 2 pi, which means that the distance of my graph here is 2 pi. So if this is my starting point, negative pi over 2, and my end point is 3 pi over 2, then you just have to do midpoints from here. Negative 1 plus 3 is 2, and 2 divided by 2 is 1, so 1 pi over 2. This is a 1, this is essentially a 2 pi over 2, and this is a 0 pi over 2. So you'll notice that you're just counting by ones. So the first thing you're going to do is inside, if you put your x values here, negative pi over 2 plus pi over 2 gives me 0. 0 plus pi over 2 gives me pi over 2. Pi over 2 plus pi over 2 gives me 2 pi over 2, which reduces to 1 pi, or just pi. Pi, or 2 pi over 2 plus 1 pi over 2 gives you 3 pi over 2. And 3 pi over 2 plus pi over 2 gives me 4 pi over 2, which is 2 pi. And then you'll recognize there's my golden row. The next thing you're going to do is find cosine at those values. So cosine at 0 is 1. Cosine at pi over 2 is 0. Cosine at pi is negative 1. Cosine at 3 pi over 2 is 0. And cosine at 2 pi is 1. The next thing you're going to do here is you're going to multiply by 2. This whole row, so I multiply by 2. 2 times 1 is 2. 0. Negative 2. 0. 2. And the last thing you're going to do, pay attention here, is then you're going to add 1. That's the shifting up one of those. So just add 1. Some common mistakes, the students switch those numbers. Some students added those numbers together, 1 plus 2, that would have been incorrect. So if we just graph it, negative pi over 2, it's to the left of the y-axis. That's at 3. At 0, I have 1. Pi over 2 is negative 1. 2 pi over 2, or pi, is going to be at 1. And then 3 pi over 2 is 3. So like I said, what's the difference between the two problems? This problem you should have between 0 and 2 pi, the inequality. Question number 8 above doesn't have a phase shift. So if I wrote PS on your paper, you don't have a phase shift on your graph, or you don't have the inequalities. Some of you who are struggling with the table, I might have written PEMDAS. That's the order of operations. Just recognizing, are you multiplying, adding, or subtracting. These two problems are out of 4 points. So 8, and that means 16, and then it's out of 16 plus 12 is 28, not 32. Good luck.